The sit-to-stand transition is a voluntary daily activity that involves moving from a sitting position to a standing position without losing your balance. The following study, the analysis of the factors that can affect the correct movement when performing this position, was performed.
We're going to begin with the first phase of the sit-to-stand, and that is flexion momentum. Here this step is flexion momentum, and so it begins really at movement initiation. Now there are two very important things that have to happen during the flexion momentum phase, and those are momentum generation at the trunk, that is the actual flexion momentum, but also moving the feet backward about 10 centimeters behind the knee. When they stand up, you'll notice that they bend forward at the hips and you get a trunk flexion. This trunk flexion shifts the center of gravity anteriorly, so their center of gravity is now more forward, and that is going to be important in order to have the momentum transfer in the next phase. The other thing about this shift forward via this trunk flexion is that it doesn't occur slowly, it actually occurs pretty rapidly. Then also, your feet will actually move along the ground posterior. You'll actually move your feet back, and in order to get proper leverage, so that during the extension you minimize the amount or work that your quads have to do. In this phase your feet are gonna move backward. And whenever we move the feet backward, what's gonna happen is, we're gonna cause ankle dorsiflexion. In other words, what is happening is the tibia is rotating forward. The next phase is the momentum transfer. Begins at liftoff, was basically when your buttocks and your thigh were no longer in contact with the seat, and it is gonna end at the point where we have maximum ankle dorsiflexion. In the momentum transfer, we're gonna use that momentum that was generated by the trunk flexion in the previous stage, really distributed to the total body, but really more the lower extremity. One of the things happen in this phase are, one is obvious, we're going to be lifting off from the seat. The second thing we're going to have is activation of the quadriceps femoris, particularly vastus lateralis, and that is to prevent excessive knee flexion. So we're not using the quads to push up, we're actually using them to prevent excess knee flexion. The third thing that must happen is increased ankle dorsiflexion, even beyond what we had at the end of the flexion momentum phase. So this tibia is going to be rotated even more forward to produce more ankle dorsiflexion, and by the time we get to the end of the momentum transfer phase, we've hit maximum ankle dorsiflexion. We also are going to have co-activation of its antagonist, the soleus, which is on the posterior part of the LE, that is to prevent excessive tibial forward translation. The next phase is extension, so we're beginning at maximum ankle dorsiflexion. When we do this movement up, when we extend upward to a standing position, notice that the foot doesn't change position, but the tibia will actually move backward on the ankle, whereas here maybe this angle between the tibia and the foot might be like a 60 degrees. Here it is more or less neutral at 90 degrees. That is actually what we call a relative plantar flexion, and normally when we think of plantar flexion we think of just going up on your tiptoes. We're actually moving the tibia backwards relative to the foot. We're still getting a plantar flexion, and this is actually going to be due to the soleus complex at the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscles. The second thing that must happen is this knee extension. So obviously over here our knees more flexed, but here the quadriceps, that is the vastus lateralis, is done really to promote that knee extension. Then the third thing that we must have is hip extension. And the major hip extensors that we're gonna see is gluteus maximus. So in the extension phase, as you're going from the sort of squatted down position to the fully erect posture, what is happening is your center of gravity is actually shifting anteriorly a little bit, and so you have sort of a forward momentum. It is just a little bit, but you have a little forward momentum due to the fact that the center of gravity as you're going up is moving forward, and if nothing else happened that may actually cause you to fall forward and do a face plant, we have to use what is called an RPA ankle strategy. So this phase begins with maximum hip extension and that just ends with really ankle flexion and extension. You're mostly going to have gastrocnemius and soleus acting as the stabilizers. In order to prevent the tibia from moving too far forward, contract the posterior muscles to prevent it from moving forward, and that is done using the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and it is called an ankle strategy for RPA.
principle we like to analyze as angular velocity. Angular velocity is the rate of change of angular displacement, and in this case is rate of change from moving forward relative to the vertical of the trunk. Angular velocity is also a vector including both magnitude and direction, a minimum amount of force produced in order to reach a certain distance for a standing position. This is required to move the trunk or hip region up and forward in the right direction in order to stand out properly. Along with hip extension, knee is also required with a certain angular velocity to be in a standing position. If yes, Ammon would like to stand up faster, more force would be required to reach a standing position in a shorter amount of time. Change in its angular motion, we find this by determining the product of the object, the rotation's mass, and its radius from its axis rotation. Here the axis rotations are the knee and hip. As yes, Ammon leans forward from hip flexion, then beginning hip and knee extension, she soon reaches her standing position. Since yes is comfortable with this movement, she naturally fills her own angular inertia and applies just the right amount of opposing force to remain standing and preventing yourself from coming too far forward. If yes carried more mass, more force would be necessary from the torso and the legs to overcome her angular inertia to lean forward, stand, and remain standing. Gravity has more influence on how much force is needed to perform the depending on her position. Center of gravity is a total effective force of gravity has on the body concentrated as a single point. In other words, it is a balance point of a system in a vertical plane as she is sitting. Her center of gravity is below her sternum, deep inside her chest. This arrow shows where her center of gravity runs through. While seated in this position, it requires a little work to begin leaning forward toward us, and as yes is leading forward, her center of gravity is shifting until it is lined up with her feet. Then she begins to stand and her feet will come back into the question and summoning her center of gravity in a standing position. This is because while sitting, yes, Ammon's base was supported the chair, which provides a no contact force for her to pull the stable position. Basement support in the area within lines connecting an outer perimeter of each of the points of support in a standing position.
Axis at the beginning of the transition, this due to the fact that the subject moves his feet back to have more support, and when he finishes stand up, this one is more in front. On the other hand, on the y-axis, the position remains almost constant because the tip of the foot has a very slight change in position. Figure 2 shows the behavior of the ankle position, which remains almost constant during the beginning of the transition and has a small negative peak almost on the point of standing, as it plays a very important role as a point of support. Figure 3 shows the behavior of the hip position, where it can be observed how there is a positive change in the x-axis that is seen as an upward inclination. In the y-axis, a similar behavior was presented, only that when standing up, the subject kept the hip position constant. In figure 4 we can see that when the subject takes off the buttocks from the chair, the knees move forward in the x-axis. This movement makes all the effort at the moment of lifting have a better distribution and avoid some poor knee positioning. Velocity is shown graphically in figure 2, and it has a congruence that does not show velocity at the beginning of the transition, since it is supportive and has almost no movement on the x-axis. Once the subject is nearly standing up, the toe obviously changes its position and there is a very small speed, but there is. In the y-axis the speed is not reflected, since rather the movement is in x. The speed of the knee is shown in figure 4, and it is interesting that there are 4 notable speed changes. 2 of them are positive peaks and the other 2 are negative. It can be inferred from the rapid changes in speed that the subject has no problem with his left knee. The mirror effect can be seen in figure 3, showing the behavior of hip speed. It is clearly seen on the y-axis that at 1 second the speed changes rapidly in a positive direction. The reverse happens on the x-axis. Speed is similar in both axes, presenting a positive peak when moving the foot back and preparing the ankle to support the lifting of the body. At the time of lifting, a slight decrease in acceleration remains constant, half a second, and finally a notable decline when the body does not exert any effort to perform a movement. Analyzing figure 4, it can be affirmed that there are 2 notable positive acceleration changes now of taking impulse to get up and when the knee is needed to be able to take a comfortable standing position. The graph of the hip velocity shows how at the time of tilting the trunk there is a positive acceleration in the y-axis. Once the subject takes an impulse to get up, it remains constant until he stands up completely.
Age and excess weight affect the way body segments function together, causing much greater overexertion in certain exercises than in others so that the body has the balance it needs in the case of overweight subjects. Keeping